آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech. How do you think counter-terrorism measures have been used in the last decade or so to restrict freedom of expression?
Well, one has to examine individual measures individually. There's no doubt that we face a serious problem with terrorism, with political violence, and there's no doubt that we face some security threats, and of course the government has to respond to them. I mean, my own view is that the best way to face security threats is rarely to close down communication. I think that's usually the wrong way to do it. And it's perfectly right to say that some counter-terrorism laws in recent years have tended to have as their aim closing down communication to an extent. One thinks of offences of encouraging terrorism, of course. I mean, no one believes that terrorism should be encouraged. The problem is how you define an act of encouragement and what precisely the encouragement is directed towards. And these always open all sorts of questions that are really relevant to the exercise of our Article 10 rights, our rights to free expression. And so one has to examine these sorts of legislative provisions with care. In the university context, of course, we want people to be free, free to speak as openly as possible without the fear of some sort of criminal law intervention on the part of the state. That is obviously an intervention that only should take place in the most extreme circumstances. I mean, obviously some speech is criminal speech. It's a crime to incite murder. It's a crime to incite racial or religious hatred. It's a crime to incite attacks, for example, on gay people. And these sorts of speech, these categories of speech have traditionally been controlled, and that's appropriate. But we just have to be very careful about expanding the areas of criminal speech, and when the government wants to do that, we have to examine those proposals, I think, with very great care.
Could you explain what the prevent duties are under the Counter-Terrorism and Security Act 2015?
The Counter-Terrorism and Security Act of 2015 gives universities for the first time a duty to play a role in the government's counter-terrorism strategy for civil society. So universities have acquired a duty to take steps to prevent people on university premises from being radicalized, from being drawn into support for terrorism. That's a fairly broadly based duty stated in those terms, but it does include, for example, a responsibility upon universities to examine with care what visiting speakers, for example, are going to say on university premises. And this is quite, I think, problematic for all sorts of reasons. And the main reason is that the sorts of behaviours that we're being asked to surveil, to police now in universities, are not behaviours which are in themselves criminal. The prevent duty requires us to prevent, insofar as possible, activities on university premises that are contrary to what are described as British values. And in the guidance associated with the legislation, British values are described as respect for democracy, the rule of law, and tolerance for other people's religious beliefs. Now, that's a very broad definition of what it is that British values amount to, and it's capable of capturing all sorts of behaviour and all sorts of expression. For example, a Marxist might argue that the rule of law is a construct designed to keep one class in power over another. Now, that is an argument which is undermining of the rule of law. Are we seriously arguing that people on universities should not be permitted to express that view? Are we seriously arguing that someone should not be allowed to make the case that democracy is a flawed system and we ought to have a theocratic system instead? It's not illegal to argue that. It's not illegal to argue that the rule of law is a class construct. It's not illegal for me to show disrespect for your religion. And if these things are not illegal, if this isn't criminal speech, why should universities have any sort of duty to control it? And if they do start to control speech which is not criminal, what impact is that likely to have on universities as havens for intellectual exchange? I think the impact is bound to be a bad one. It's bound to be a chilling impact. And so I think we should devise a response to the prevent legislation, which, while it allows us to be compliant, preserves our ability to speak freely.